So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the afternoon session, which is going to address the question, is there a new agenda for Nordic-Baltic countries? And that is a new agenda within the context of the EU and the North-Atlantic Alliance. And I have a very distinguished panel to answer this question. But before I do it, I have to warn you that while there is a very close relation between the Nordic countries, there is one subject on which we will never agree, and that is deeply divisive between Sweden and Denmark, which is who engaged most and with most impact in the Baltic countries following the end of the Cold War.
Is that even a question?
and the
I know
truth
the
is,
answer to that, actually.
the truth is that when the Cold War ended, the Nordic countries saw an historical opportunity to engage with the Baltic countries, to become independent states and to become democratic, prosperous members of both the European Union and the North Atlantic Alliance. That by no means was an obvious development, and Finland, Sweden, and Denmark in particular engaged at all levels, both in the free Baltic countries and with our partners within the European Union and within NATO to make enlargement happen, and especially to make enlargement happen at the same time, keeping the door open not only to some, but to all. And as we were engaging in this endeavor, we were also engaging to try to help and assist building societies in these free countries based on some of the ideas that are common to the Nordic countries. And I will not elaborate on them, but just quote a few of the terms that have actually also been recurrent in the debate that we have been through over the last couple of days. Issues such as cohesion, trust, flexibility, and a relative low level of inequality. And all of these notions, of course, can be elaborated, and we may do it during the discussion. But the question that is now posing us is that role as a group of countries that have a lot in common and share the Baltic as our common area. Do we still have a special role? Are we called upon in the present very different and very rapidly changing environment of the European Union and of NATO, and indeed in the entire
mainās.
region?
Vai mums ir kāda īpaša loma? Vai mums atkal vajadzētu spēlēt īpašu lomu?
Nordic cooperation a role to play, together with the Baltic countries, and should we have a voice faced with the ongoing discussion in Europe that of course relates to fundamental issues such as the further development of the economic cooperation following the French elections, the German elections, the issue of Brexit, the issue of strengthening a common defense. All of this is setting a new agenda for Europe, and the question is it also setting a new agenda for us as Baltic and Nordic countries on how to engage and how to be an active part of those two organizations, setting our footprint in their further developments. And I can think of nobody who could answer these questions more and have a better background for doing it in our panel today, and I'll quote them in the order that I will call upon you to to address these issues. Mr. Orban Alin is the Speaker of the Swedish Parliament, long-serving, prominent Swedish politician, extremely well-versed in both the construction of the Nordic welfare states and indeed the role we are playing and not playing in the region and wider in the EU. Uffe Ellemann-Jensen, which I'm afraid to say is my old boss, many years ago when he was a foreign minister, and he was foreign minister in the years leading up to the end of the Cold War, and indeed in the first years after the Cold War, and was on our side, on the Danish side, the chief architect of a very active engagement in the Baltic countries, an engagement which Uffe has been pursuing ever since, both as an active leading politician in the opposition, and since then in his retirement as someone who is always there when the issue of the Baltic states and the interests of them are coming up. Mrs. Anne W. is the director for Northern Europe in the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council, and she is Secretary General of the Swedish Defence Association, and someone who has worked for a lifetime on the very same issues, knowing in depth every aspect, and in particular, of course, the security aspects. And at the end, number two, from the end here, our American guests, Tim Thompson, who was introduced to me earlier as a legend in the Pentagon, where you're not now, but he was the go-to guy for a generation on issues relating to the Nordic countries and the Baltic countries, the American expert, the Pentagon expert on developments in our part of the world, especially in terms of defense and security. And Jim is now, you're now in the NATO, and you are senior fellow at the Transatlantic Security Program, Center for New American Security. Without further ado, Mr. Urban, would you please, Mr. Alin, would you please start off?
Thank you very much, Bo. And you're absolutely correct to say that the Nordic countries already from the beginning spent a lot of effort in, reaching out to the Baltic countries and helping them. But you actually mentioned only 4 Nordic countries, and there are 5 Nordic countries. And you didn't mention the small country of Iceland. And actually, they were the first one who recognized the Baltic states as independent states. So actually, the smallest of our Nordic countries played an important role at that time. And I think that's worth mentioning while we have this Swedish-Danish fight about who did most, right? So I would like to highlight Iceland when it comes to that. I was in Tallinn in January in 1991. I was sleeping in a hotel in the city center, and I could watch CNN. And I woke up and I watched the CNN, and I saw Soviet troops storming the TV tower in Vilnius. And this was 11th of January in 1991. And I was there on a social democratic mission, because I'm politically neutral nowadays as a speaker, but I'm still a social democrat. And it was a shock for me. I was younger at that time, and I realized, how close the fear and the anxiety was among the countries, which I didn't realize until I actually was there myself. I went up to the Estonian parliament and helped the people there building the barricades. And I went down, bought sausages and cheese, and gave it to them, and felt I really was part of an historical moment. But I was nervous and afraid the whole time, because you could see on the TV screen what was going on in Vilnius. And I'm saying this because nowadays, 26 years later, we feel fat and happy and can't really, understand the fear we had at that time. We had a war in Balkan. We were nervous about violence breaking out here in the Baltic countries. So after the TV tower and the people getting killed there, the Icelandic were first out, recognizing the Baltic states as independent states. And after that, you know, the whole mass of Nordic cooperation went into these 3 Baltic countries because we wanted to support them in their struggle for independence. Not only because we wanted to do it for them, it was good for us too, of course, that we could secure, have, you know, a good neighborly relationship with these countries. But we were nervous all the time about, you know, what's going to happen here because of the ethnic population, Russians in Riga, where we are here, and so on. It was a big debate at that time. I took part in it from my party position. You know, we were here, we were trying to do everything we could. Sweden, as a military non-aligned country, actually gave military support during this time. Lots of equipment was handed over to the Baltic countries because we thought it was the right thing to do, because we wanted to strengthen the sovereignty of these independent states. And now, when we are happy seeing that all these 3 countries are members of the European Union and NATO, I really think it's important to remember that in the 90s and in the beginning of 2000, that was not a done deal. I mean, I belonged to a group that Ron Asmus put together, a secret group that was trying to convince countries that were hesitant of bringing the 3 Baltics into NATO. Because at that time, lots of countries said, no, that will only upset the Russians, they are undefendable, and there were lots of, you know, different views about this. So I'm very happy to say that we used, I'm extremely happy to say that we actually used the window of opportunity at that time to bring the Baltic countries into NATO and to the European Union. Because is there anyone here who believes that we would be able to manage to do that today when we have such an assertive Russia? I think actually the argument against letting these countries in would have been much stronger today. So I'm very happy that we used that opportunity. And that is what the Nordic-Baltic cooperation is about, is taking the chances for increased opportunities, doing the best thing when it comes. And if you look upon from the outside of the Nordic countries, I think this is important to underline. You can see that some countries are members of the European Union, some not. You can see that some countries are members of NATO, some not. Other countries are members of the Eurozone, some are not. And that's kind of interesting that these 5 Nordics with the 3 Baltics, nowadays in the NBA format, have so different views on so important stuff. But has that stopped us from having a very close cooperation? No, not at all. We have been extremely smart in finding ways of cooperating in the format of the European Union and in NATO to strengthen our relationship. And I must say that is based on the like-mindedness of these 8 countries. The Nordic-Baltics work together in lots of different regional cooperations, which is extremely important. And it is what many people in Brussels, you know, in the bureaucracy of Brussels, consider it to be an Alphabetensuppe of all different kind of organizations that we work together on here in the Nordic-Baltic countries. But that has been a success story. As long as we do economically well, we secure our borders, we cooperate, and we do things that strengthen the Nordic-Baltic area. That's good for us. And I would like to mention one thing, that we just ended a military exercise in Sweden the other day, Aurora 17. Approximately 20,000 soldiers involved, 1,500 from the United States, and also from Denmark, together with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and some soldiers from France. And that shows how easily we can cooperate and doing very important stuff, you know, to increase the awareness of our region, the strategic interest of our region. So I really would like to highlight Aurora 17 as a wonderful moment here, because it was 20 years ago since Sweden has an exercise of that size before. I see that you're tired of me now.
Thank you. You referred to the Nordic countries taking and the Baltic countries using the window of opportunity just in the years after the Cold War. Is there another window of opportunity now? Are we in a situation where there is a new window of opportunity?
In my view, it's not the same window of opportunity. That was extremely important that we used that window during that time. Now it's more like that I want to put in more energy into the Nordic-Baltic cooperation, because I remember the 90s when we sent over, you know, kids and students and football teams and everyone over to have this people-to-people contact. And there is a lot of context going on today, but will that continue for a long future? I'm not so sure about that. So it's really important that we give energy and impetus to the cooperation we have. Of course, the Nordic and the Baltic has a lot to offer. When it comes to economic reforms, we have been very successful in reforming our respective countries, which I think the European Union could learn a little bit from, especially from the Baltic countries, I must say. And also with Brexit, when UK leaves, a strong partner of Sweden will leave the European Union. And of course, we need also to reach out to other like-minded to form, a consensus what we want the European Union to do. So of course, there are lots of room for improvements, but I don't think you can compare that to the window of opportunity to bring in the Baltics into NATO and the European Union.
Thank you. Before passing the floor on to Uffe, let me just remind you, I should have done from the beginning, that this conference, of course, it's live streamed like all the other main events here. So in addition to you listening to this, there are people out there listening and following, and we are also getting Twitter messages in as we go along, and I shall try to follow them here and perhaps convey some of the questions that are coming in on the Twitter to the panelists as we move ahead. Uffe, over to you.
Thank you, Bo. Now the question put to us is, could the MB8, 5 Nordic plus 3 Baltic countries, could the MB8 do more together, and should we do more together? My answer to both questions is yes, indeed. Now, let's try to take a helicopter view of who we actually are. Put together, we are almost 30 million people, still a dwarf compared to the big neighbor in the east. But put together again, our combined GNP is larger than that of Russia's. And then some of us have very special ties. Sometimes you don't hear that when we speak to each other. Reminds me a little of some twins I have in my large, wonderful group of grandchildren. The twins don't speak very nicely to each other, but they are soulmates. So are the Danes, the Norwegians, and the Swedes. We understand each other, even though we sometimes pretend not to. We understand each other. And we have a long, long history of shared culture, shared values, shared language, etc. So we are soulmates within a larger group that sometimes, and in particular the newcomers, seem to find it a little difficult to understand what is this thing about common values and so on. One guy who understood it was Thomas Ilves, who once said, of course he was born in Stockholm, Thomas Ilves once said, "My dream is that my country should become yet another boring Nordic country." That was well put, because that showed his deep understanding of what we also are. We are sometimes sinking back into the complacency of having been so affluent and so generously treated by fate that we have. And that complacency sometimes looks a little odd as seen from abroad. But do we, if you take a look at the NBA, do we share values? Well, to a certain degree we do, only to a certain degree. Do we share interests? Oh yes, we do. Because look what has happened over the last 5 to 10 years. 10 years ago, we still believed that our common dream of having societies, open societies, secure societies, free societies, that this dream had come through and could not be threatened again. Reminds me of the latest report made by a Danish commission that should form the basis for a defense agreement in the Danish parliament. It was made only, I think, 5 years ago, and it said, within the foreseeable future, there will be no new security risks in the Baltic Sea region. Look what has happened since then. We have what I would call the PBT. And PBT sounds like something very dangerous, very poisonous, and indeed it is. It stands for Putin, Brexit, Trump. We all suffer from the effects of PBT, and this is why we need to continue with the acronyms. This is why we need EFP, the Enhanced Forward Presence in the Baltic countries, the new frontline states by NATO. Now, this is, in my opinion, an area in which we can do much more to cooperate. It looks a little confusing if you look again from the helicopter at these 8 countries, because you have some of us are in the EU, some are not. Norway and Iceland are not in the EU. Some are in NATO, some are not. Sweden and Finland are not in NATO. Some participate in the European Common Defence Policy, some do not. Some of those who participate are not members of the EU, Norway, and some of those who don't are members but behave stupidly there. That's my own country I'm talking about, so therefore I can allow myself to be a little fresh in the mouth. But it's a confusing picture, but still, we have managed to cooperate in a number of areas. Urban just told us about this Swedish exercise that took place very recently, the Aurora. Whoever found that name really knew how to make somebody angry over there. Well done. And if you look at the annual Baltops exercises in the Baltic Sea, well, as late as in 2008, Russia participated as part of the PFP that used to exist in those days, and they participated. They don't participate any longer, of course not, but Sweden and Finland are very, very active participants. And the Americans participate, the Canadians participate. So we find a number of areas in which we look around these problems of belonging or not belonging to this or that. And then we have established something that mostly exists by name right now, NORDEFCO, Nordic Defence Cooperation, trying to analyze a number of areas in which we could cooperate much more. Areas like procurement, training, education, joint operations, crisis management, etc. Some of you will remember that 10 years ago, the old former foreign minister of Norway, Thorvald Stoltenberg, he made the Stoltenberg report on new ideas to revive the Nordic cooperation. And he did so more or less as a result of being frustrated because Norway was outside of the European Union. But he identified a number of areas that has actually been brought into reality now. What we need today is a new Stoltenberg report covering not only the Nordic countries, but covering the NB8, trying to find ways in which to overcome, even stronger than we have managed to do today, this difference we have in defense structures. It is, of course, being debated in Sweden and Norway whether or not you will join NATO, and it's not up to outsiders to try to participate too much in that debate.
I like the too much.
No. But it's up to you, but as we have proven already, we can be pragmatic here. Of course, you have a problem with the Article 5, which you will not be covered by as long as you are not members, but again, that's up to yourself. We can find ways to cooperate. So my plea is to those who are sitting on top of the mountain today, get a new Stoltenberg report and try to do something more, because when we combine our forces, as illustrated by the combined size of our GNPs, if we combine our forces, in particular when the Finns are added, because they have really something to contribute with, then we are a formidable force that can take care of part of the security that we should be able to take care of without undermining the Atlantic structures and the European structures. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Uffe, and thank you for this specific proposal to try to sit down and systematically map out new areas of cooperation. I'll pass on the floor to Anna W. Please.
Anna Wieslander, thank you. And thanks for inviting me to the Riga conference again. It's one of my absolute favorite conferences. It's great to be here. I'd like to turn to history in order to approach this subject a bit and highlight a few great examples of this region where we have had periods of high connectivity. And perhaps it's symptomatic for this discussion that's almost, if we look back 1,000 years, we had Knud the Great of Denmark, Knud, forming a North Sea empire, united England, Denmark, and then later on Norway, Sweden. And he was also actually the first, you can say, European regent of the Nordic. And he transferred, in a way, Scandinavia, Viking Scandinavia, to a more Christian European context. And I also think this Christianity brought some of the values that we are discussing today to transform them into universal values, but it still created some kind of common ground or community for us further on. And then secondly, important era in connectivity was, of course, the Hanseatic League, or the Hansa. Commercial and defensive cooperation initiated from North German towns and merchant communities. And the Hansa actually dominated the commercial activities of the Baltics from around 13th century to the 15th century. Centers were Lübeck, it was Visby, Gotland, it was also here, Riga, Tallinn, Tartu, we had Gdansk, Novgorod, but also to the west, England through Cologne. So even there was centuries of very high connectivity, trade, defensive issues, education, church, all combined. And then, of course, third example, since I'm Swedish, the period in Sweden when Sweden was the great power of Northern Europe, 17th and 18th century. And we had King Gustavus Adolphus II, who thought, his idea was that trade and tariffs, that is what we need, the revenue of the state. And in order to get that, we need to dominate the Baltic Sea. That was his slogan. So my father would kill me for this Latin slogan, but I tried to pronounce it anyway. Dominum Maris Baltici. That was what everyone was supposed to aim for, and we did. So in 1658, we peaked the Swedish Empire, and it was extended over Sweden, it was Finland, parts of Latvia, Estonia, Russia, a bit of Germany, Norway, perhaps I forgot something. But that was also a period of very much of integration and connectivity here. And then, of course, we have to recognize that we also had periods of brutal disconnectivity. And I'm thinking of the Cold War, when the Iron Curtain actually went through the Baltic Sea. And the three Baltic states, Poland, East Germany, were separated from its Nordic neighbors. And as we heard here, Urban gave great examples of when the Berlin Wall started to crumble. Even before it crumbled, we were there with historical ties, with engagement and a sense of community. And we reconnected, along also, I would argue, historical ties, politically, economically, military, socially. And we kept on developing the region, and it turned out, in many ways, to be one comparatively of the most prosperous and perhaps peaceful in the world for quite some years. And we all know that we are not exactly there right now. But where are we now, and what could we say about a possible new start for a Nordic-Baltic agenda and what could be the components. Well, I would like to argue that I believe that we once again are in a transformative period. I think it has to do with three major things. And actually, Uffe, your PBT abbreviation works for what I'm going to say as well, but I'm going to say it a bit differently. So we have Russia and the changing behavior of Russia. And I don't need to say much more in this, for this audience, I think, but that has spurred an urge to cooperate much more intensely on security and defense issues in this region. And then we have Brexit, and an EU without the UK. From a North European perspective, it's quite a different EU, I would argue, because the UK has been driving issues. It's been outside of the euro. It's been pushing on market economy, free market things, on innovation, digitalization. It's also been strict on defense issues and the role of Nato. It's been tough on Russia. It's been pursuing an open door policy, both within the EU and NATO. So in a lot of issues, Northern European states have tended to cluster with the UK, and this will not be the case anymore. And we will have an EU where Germany and France are the driving engines, as we start seeing. And this will change the shape of the EU, I would argue. We don't know exactly how this will fall out, but if we look at the EU in the future, it will be a different EU. And then the third point on the United States and the relation to Europe. Now we have President Trump and the unpredictability of the president, which is both it's part of his characteristics, it seems. So I think we have to live with that to some extent. On the other hand, I think it's important to recognize that it is a new administration, and from what we can see on various points, it's moving more towards perhaps more mainstream Republican foreign policy on certain points. So there will be a check and balances on this, but I still think there will be a high level of uncertainty that we will have to take in when it comes to the transatlantic relation going ahead to some extent. On the other hand, I think it's perhaps even more important to look at the US-European relationship in the longer term, and that it is changing anyway. It's despite Trump, or even because of Trump, we would have a changing relationship. And why is that? Well, if you look from the EU from the outside, you would see a rather prosperous EU, a rather grown-up partner, a rather rich partner. And of course that, I think, influences also the view from the US. So while we in the EU has been, to my mind, a bit obsessed with our crisis, we have talked a lot about our crisis. You can, we often find bullet points with 8 different kinds of crises for the EU. But on the other hand, we are still the second largest economy in the world. We are the second largest trader of goods. We are the largest, leading foreign investor, for instance. We are a community of values. We are a postmodern, trans-sovereign body, and we have a lot of strengths to build on. So I think that the US recognizes this to some extent and looking for a new kind of partnership. And in that, I also believe that the US is perhaps not likely to micromanage the security development of Europe as we come along. And the US is perhaps not as likely to keep pushing for European integration, which has been helping us come together, which means that we have to come together more by our own driving force and take ourselves seriously in this regard. And in all these aspects, I think there is a role for more of Nordic-Baltic cooperation. When it comes to security, when it comes to prosperity, and when it comes to values. I believe that once again, we have to recognize that smaller countries, we have more influence and a stronger voice when we come together, when we are more coordinated and where we can find common ground. And the institutions are important for us. As Uffe pointed out, it's not congruent, the EU-NATO framework, for instance. But still, there are close ties. And to my mind, an agenda that would build on these 3 pillars, where we could find common ground, would be something to suggest ahead. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for these remarks and for elaborating the nature of this transformative period that we are living through. And now, Tim Townsend, please.
Well, thank you very much. And like Anna, it's great to be here at Riga. And this is my first time, and I just regret not having been here every year before, but I was busy. But it's great to be here finally, and with a lot of friends. Before I start, I do want to say it's a great honor to be here with Uffe Ellemann-Jensen. And I say that because I first began to work with the Nordic countries in 1990. And Uffe played a very big role during those days, particularly with the Gulf War. And I just wanted to say, this is the first time I've met you, and you had a lot to do with my career. You didn't know that, but when the Danes sent the Overt Fisher into the Gulf, that launched my career in the Pentagon, so I appreciate that. But it's a great honor to be with you. I'm in an interesting position in this panel as an American to talk about the Nordics. I mean, this is great, and it kind of reminds me of the GIF, you know, that GIF that you have on the internet or on Twitter. And there's a GIF that's popularly used of someone eating popcorn, and that's the GIF that you use when somebody else is in trouble, and you're with that GIF you're saying, "I'm having a lot of pleasure watching you in trouble." Well, I can tell you, my GIF was watching the Nordic-Baltic countries for the past 30-odd years, and I was always eating up popcorn, watching you all do all these various things, participating in them, but it was always something interesting and inspiring in a lot of ways, and so that was what that GIF was representative of what I was doing. Talking about the early days of the Balts and coming out of the Soviet Union, and we won't dwell too much on history, although Anna, I have to say your history lesson was great. I admire you for that. But on 11 January 1991, when you were in your hotel room watching CNN and the Soviets storming the antenna, the TV stations, so I was in the Pentagon still as the Nordic desk, but we were in the middle of Desert Storm. And so you can imagine in Washington, and particularly in the Pentagon, that's where the attention was. But I was having to deal with that as well as what was happening in the Balkans. In fact, I mean the Baltics, I was the first Baltic desk officer there. They said, "Well, Jim, you do Scandinavia, you can do the Baltics too." I said, "Well, okay." And so I was looking at that, and I will tell you, just for the record, you know, having watched that, and also having watched what happened in Czechoslovakia and in Hungary, the idea that Soviet troops left the Baltic countries, it's still a shock that all happened as smoothly as it did. And I think all of us can be proud of the work that we all did afterwards to to build back up the 3 Baltic nations. And every time I come here, I have great pride in that, and it's a wonderful thing. But on 11 January 1991, it was not a sure thing. Just a quick point about the Danish-Swedish fight over who did the most to do that rebuilding. It was the U.S. did the most. I'm just kidding. But I do want to say that that was a great time of diplomacy. The Balt Sea Talks is what we called them. And we all would gather. We gathered once in Stockholm, and we gathered in Copenhagen, I believe, so everyone played a role. But Christian Fischer is in here somewhere, and I just wanted to give him a shout-out. He was very active in those days, because the Danish Minister of Defense at the time led the charge in a lot of ways. Sweden as well, and also UK, Germany played major roles too, as we did, and it was a great camaraderie. And I think that began to show how we could come together and do great things. That was the first sign of that, as we all got together to do that. You know, when I read the agenda for today, what we were to talk about, I was very shocked in the way it was read. I mean, the way it was written, because it made it sound like there was a monolithic Nordic-Baltic group. And from the Washington perspective, and from working with these countries, I know that's not the case. And I was thinking of this famous saying by the American humorist Mark Twain. Mark Twain was trying to answer the question, does history repeat itself? And he said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so I kind of turned that around a little bit, and I said, there isn't a Nordic homogeneous monolith, but they do rhyme. So there is among the Nordic nations, and even Nordic-Baltic, rhyming going on. But I will tell you, as we talk about this new agenda for the Nordic-Baltic countries, and in the write-up about this, our panel, what the Nordic-Baltic new agenda could be and what they could do, I thought we kind of were jumping ahead of ourselves a bit, because there is still a lot of work to be done in the Nordic-Baltic region to strengthen that cohesion before you can take on the European Union. And from the Washington perspective, as I considered all this, I thought that we ought to think about a couple of points about what has happened since 11 January 1991, when the Soviets went into that TV tower. It has taken a long time, not just for Nordic-Baltic cooperation to actually begin to come together, but Nordic cooperation. And I think Anna had gone through some important history about that, and it's been alluded to here. But from the Washington perspective, when I first started in 1990, I remember recommending to one of our allies at the time, who was a Nordic, and in 1990, I said, why don't all of you, the Scandinavian nations, work together in a regional? And they jumped down my throat and said, we will never work with the other Nordic countries. We're NATO allies. That's where we put. I won't tell you who it was. And I said, okay, I got that. And so the idea of Nordic nations coming together and towards a common goal has taken a long time. And it was the Baltic Sea work during the 1990s that helped to do that, because everyone had a common purpose. It was to work with the Baltics. I think that Nordic Defense Cooperation, NORDEFCO, that was mentioned, that's a bit of a miracle, let me tell you. You're dealing with NATO nations, non-NATO nations, and some very nationalistic feeling about just how far Nordic cooperation will go before it has to end, because really our emphasis is going to be whether it's in the EU or whether it's in NATO. It only goes so far, and so there is still more work to do in Nordic defense cooperation. It's a great movement. It's what, about 2 or 3 years old now. There is a lot that has come from that, things that would not have been possible 15 years ago. But there's still more work to be done to strengthen the cooperation in very sensitive areas between the Nordic members of NORDEFCO. I would also say that you mentioned Iceland very appropriately. And Finland, too, by the way. There's not a Finn up here. I'm representing Finland here. I'm carrying the Finnish and the Norwegian flags. But I think, really, when you look at Iceland, too, we do have a tendency to leave them out, but I cannot tell you what a crucial role Iceland plays for European security and for NATO in terms of where it's located and their willingness to cooperate with us, particularly the United States. So I thought it would be good, as we talk about Nordic and Nordic-Baltic cooperation and vis-a-vis the EU, that just to highlight that Iceland actually, in terms of security, plays a tremendous role. And they do it very, very willingly in a very sensitive political environment. So I will say that. Just to finish up, 2 points. One is that as we talk about can the Nordic-Baltic countries make the difference in discussions about the direction of the EU political, security, and economic reform towards a Europe that takes action? This is in our little pamphlet here. But it's the idea that, is there a window? You mentioned earlier, is there a window for Nordic-Baltic cooperation in the EU to help out on Brexit and all this type of thing? And yeah, I mean, sure, there's a window there, but I've thought it's been a very interesting exercise in geometry for me, as I thought about how would the Nordic-Baltic EU members have an impact there during a time of Brexit. What would be the essential ingredients to having an impact? Particularly if you've got Germany and you've got France, UK is pulling out. How would you all then come together and actually be able to change the course of things within the European Union, particularly if Germany or France were not happy about that? I spent 4 years at NATO. I know what it's like to fight against some nations who are determined not to let you have your way. It's very difficult. And so I think that certainly is possible. But I think so much depends on the alliance. Certainly the alliances that are developed based on individual issues. But I think there's a lot of work to do in order to have a strong voice and muscle within the European Union to have it go in another direction, I think the alliances, not just the ad hoc ones, but the alliances, the political alliances to put together are going to be absolutely critical, particularly with Southern Europe, and which has its own agenda and its own outlook. So I will be eating popcorn in that GIF as I watch you put together your alliance to actually have an impact within the European Union. And my last point is this. One thing that's really different now that I don't think we think about a whole lot, what's different now in the Nordic-Baltic context than where it was, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, is that the U.S. is in the middle of it. And I think Aurora is a great example. There we were participating in the Aurora exercise. We were on Gotland with a Patriot battery, which was a huge thing. And we have in Washington, when I left, we were having all kinds of meetings with the Nordics, with the Nordic-Baltics, trilateral meetings with Finland and Sweden, Finland and Sweden and ourselves. Lots of variable geometry there where the U.S. has been much more of a presence than we have in the past. And I think that is a different, that allows for I hope, it allows for a feeling of security among the Nordic-Baltic nations to do what they have to do in terms of the European Union, because we're there and we've got your backs. I think someone here was talking about Article 5. I think, Uffe, you were mentioning, there's that while you don't have Article 5, but you do have the United States. And when Vice President Biden was in Stockholm and when Vice President Pence was in the Baltics, we said as much. It might not be Article 5, and we can be a zany country to be allied with, but this time around, you've got the United States in the middle of things, and I think that hopefully will bring a degree of confidence to move forward into the EU and to do things.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing this out. It's an important point, but also for your good remarks on our difficult relationship to institutions and how difficult it is to put the 5 Nordic, and let alone the 8 Nordic-Baltic countries, into fixed institutions. I should remind us, though, that the Nordic Council of Ministers actually is an institution that is represented in all of the 3 Baltic capitals with a pretty solid representation. I think actually their representation here is bigger than our national representations for all of us. So we do have this institutional setup, but of course you are right in pointing out that it's not very close to us. I would like to take a brief second round and perhaps turn the attention less backwards and more towards what we can actually do now. And I would highlight 3 things that have been touched upon and where I think we have, in the present context, some particular abilities in those 8 countries that are slightly similar but different to the rest of Europe. One is that we are pretty good at globalization. We have been, in all the Nordic and Baltic countries, pretty good at meeting technology, at meeting open trade, at meeting modern society, and embracing it and trying to take advantage of it and see the possibilities that is inherent. And to me, that is one of the big issues that the EU is facing, indeed we are all facing, is how do we cope with the disruption, frankly, of globalization. So that's one issue. Can we do something in terms of us 8 in this area to make Europe more amenable and more open towards that? And closely linked to that is that we see, both because of deliberate activities to undermine the credibility of our institutions, as we have been discussing throughout this conference and elsewhere, but also because of some of the aspects of globalization, that we find it increasingly difficult all over the world to define ourselves and our own nation, build and retain our nation without doing it in a way that is rejecting the outside world. I mean, there is the America First rhetoric, which is of course just one echo of this, and can we together enhance our respective nation buildings? Can we learn by the experience that we have, each of us, to be confident in what we are individually and thus more open towards each other? And the last, which is a slightly different in character, but I think you've all of you referred to defense cooperation, but you had the privilege of doing so without really taking on the dilemma. We have sort of the established defense cooperation within NATO. We have the bilateral, as Jim was alluding to, with the two countries that are not members of NATO. But then we have now a big push in the EU to build up a defense dimension. Is that something we should be pushing for in this context? Not as an alternative to NATO, but as a configuration that would actually serve us well in this region, because we have these differences in our relation to NATO. And then we have, of course, the local or the regional defense cooperation between us. So how do you see the interplay between what we do in defense between the 8, what we do in defense between the 27, and what we do in defense at the level of the alliance, which most of us are members of, and which the rest of you have close relations to? So globalization, nation building, and defense. Erwin, will you start trying to comment on some of these?
Thank you, Bo. First of all, when it comes to globalization, I actually think that the Nordic and the Baltic states are very well placed to do something when it comes to globalization. And why I'm saying that is, you're right, we are embracing change. We are very quick to adapt to new technologies and so on, as I said in my speech before, and especially the Baltic countries, I would say, very good in that. But there is another factor that I think plays a role, that we have lots of people now criticizing globalization, and that is that we have not really been able to make the globalization work for all. Lots of people feel, that there is only an elite that benefits from the globalization and the rest is losing out. And I actually think that the welfare states that we have up here in the Nordic countries has been more resilient to this kind of views anyhow, because it's more obvious, it's more visible that actually the globalization, our export orientation, the openness to the world has actually been beneficial for lots of people. Not all. I think we can do a lot more actually to get more people benefiting from it. But compared to many other countries, I would say that we have been more successful in not distributing, is not the right word, but the fruit of the globalization, of our efforts, has been able to pick for more people here than in many other countries.
And how is that? What is the mechanism for which we have been successful in doing that?
Oh, that's, I'm a speaker, so I'm politically neutral. But I think it's pretty obvious that you need to create some kind of welfare state where you have certain securities and guarantees that you can feel safe in this quickly changing environment. And what I'm talking about in Sweden, for instance, if you have a support for people that are unemployed, people will embrace change. If they feel that they are secure in having help to find another job, at least in Sweden, and I know it's for the Nordic countries, I'm not so sure about the Baltics, but in many other countries there is a tendency to try to keep the old jobs instead of looking for the new ones. And I would say in the Nordic countries we don't have that attitude. We know the old jobs are old jobs. We're looking for new jobs, and we trust ourselves that people that will be affected of this globalization will be taken care of. They will have unemployment benefits, and they will have vocational training. They will have a chance to get back to the workplace, to another job. And I think that is important. And I see other tendencies in Europe where people are more talking, closing borders, being afraid of competition from abroad, and we do, stop the competition. And that is not the way forward. And in this sense, I really think that the Nordic-Baltic countries could be a voice in the European Union to be more open and more, embracing the globalization, and also have a recipe for how we can make it work for more people. There are two other subjects that I would like us to engage in too. I know there is an enormous enlargement fatigue in the European Union. No one wants to talk about it. In my view, the enlargement has been the biggest success of the European Union. That has created a Europe that is, extremely stable and has promoted democracy and human rights. And I think we should still be in the forefront of talking about, countries' right to be members of the European Union. And what I'm talking about then is countries like Ukraine and Moldova and others, not giving up. And I think the NBA can play an important role, because at a certain moment of time in the future, the time will again be ripe for enlargement, and I think we should always be there pushing for it. Another subject, and that is a little bit sad to say, I've been traveling around as a young kid, to the Central and Eastern Europe, and a lot to Poland and Czechoslovakia at that time. And we can see that the Visegrad 4 is a format that is a little bit sliding away from the consensus of the European Union.
Or at least two of them, I think.
Yeah,
fair to say only two of them.
Let's say two then. Yes. Hungary and Poland is sliding away, right? And that hurts. It hurts. And I have been trying as a speaker of Swedish Parliament to travel to these countries and meet my counterparts, because I really think it's important to talk to them, and really have a conversation among friends. And I do believe that actually the Nordic and the Baltic countries could do more in the format also talking to these countries, I don't know how to put it, but get them back on track, trying to embrace them and see what we can do, because I'm afraid of this tendency that we see at the moment.
Thank you. There is the one encouraging thing, that the support for the EU in the public opinion in both of these countries is actually quite high and mounting. But of course we have other problems. Uffe.
Well, I agree with the speaker that in our part of Europe, we should not be, as you said, critical vis-à-vis globalization, because it has served us all good, and we should try to be the good examples of how you can live with globalization and get the best out of it. The kind of solidarity that you find as a network in our societies here could be a model for others. I can well understand why the voter in Detroit feels sad about globalization and therefore believes in the stupid tweets about America first and whatever have you. I can well understand that, considering what he got out of globalization, and you see the same elsewhere. And this is broadening this argument out a little. This is why it's so sad for us in our part of Europe to see the UK leave EU, because they were, like we, strong proponents of free trade. And free trade is losing a strong voice when the Brits, if they leave, when the Brits are leaving the EU. They seem to be dragging their feet, but all right. Now, defense cooperation could be a key in which we could try to maintain a British interest in Europe. And this is why I underlined so much, one reason that I underlined so much in my first remarks, that we should do something more to cooperate on defense, because the British are part of that, and they're already, you already have one institution where the Brits and the Nordic-Baltic countries are sitting down once a year talking about this. And you are right, Bo, of course, if you look at the institutions, you have a lot of problems there. But we have so many institutions in the Nordic-Baltic region, so many institutions. And that illustrates, in a way, how pragmatic we have become over the years to find ways around the problems. All right, you cannot find an easy way around the problem that only if you are a full member do you have the support of Article 5. All right, we'll find something else. And I was very happy to hear that picture about the Americans sitting there eating popcorn. I much prefer you sitting there eating popcorn than kicking the can down the street.
While eating popcorn.
Yeah. Well, you cannot do that while eating popcorn without spilling the popcorn in the gutter.
Which we do regularly. So.
Exactly. So don't spill the popcorns. But again, I strongly believe in the Atlantic dimension of our security. You should not make the foolish assumption that you can do without it. But we can do more if we pool our forces together. And even though, fortunately, there seem to be some grown-up people around the White House, there is still this mountain of tweets coming out from the little choppy fingers every morning when he has watched the TV. And all right, these tweets comes from the President of the United States. And fortunately, the grown-ups are saying, well, don't take care of that. And that doesn't cover it. Still, some people might start to believe in it. And if the wrong kind of people starts to believe in it, we are in a mess. So we'll have to prepare for being in such a mess. And we can only do that by pooling our strengths much better and more effective than we have been doing so far. It can be done. We have proven that in the past.
Did I hear a very devoted European not say he supports a stronger European defense cooperation?
No. I support that. As I mentioned before, Denmark is not part of that. We have this awful opt-out.
Who made that anyway?
No, that's a long story.
To be fair, it is a long story.
I'll tell you another story about that. Some of you may know about the secret Swedish capital of Karlsborg.
Of course, it's my constituency.
Yeah. Oh, really? It's a beautiful spot at the coast of the lake Vättern, in the northern part of it. And Karlsborg was created, I think, in the late 19th century as an extra capital in the case of Stockholm being attacked. I went there a couple of years ago because I love to travel in that part of Sweden. And there I saw that this expeditionary force within the European defense cooperation that you call the Nordic-Baltic battle group, consisting of Sweden, Finland, Norway, the Baltic countries, and Ireland. Funny composition. They were stationed there. They are under Swedish command, and they had a special corps sign here. It was the Swedish lion, a male lion with a big mane. But the lion, and excuse me, but the lion missed something between the legs, something lions used to make other legs. I was told by one of the soldiers there that this was a concession to the women working in the Swedish defense. Don't know if it was true. But a little later, I met Carl Bildt, who was at that time Swedish foreign minister. We met at the Mere conference in Tallinn, and I said, Carl, I just went there to your secret capital. I saw your battle group up there with the sign. Tell me, do you have an impotent battle group there? I thought that was very funny. But Carl looked at me as ice cold as only a Swede can look at a Dane. And then he said, you are probably the last person in Europe who should make funny jokes about exactly that.
Oh my God.
Touché. I believe that there is going now, because Macron said it, Merkel is going to pick it up, and maybe that can cover over some of the problems she'll be facing with the new FDP and their attitude towards the euro. So I believe there will be a strong European defense cooperation. The Swedes, the Finns are definitely going to work for that. Only the stupid Danes are sitting behind and trying to find out when we can try to find a way to get in. And this is going to be one of the keys to keep the bridge attached to our part of Europe.
Anna, it's by high time that you get a chance to respond. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, I will come back to that, whether Sweden and Finland are on the same level when it comes to driving European defense cooperation. I would say not. But let me first comment on globalization and the issue, because I think that's the core issue actually for Nordic-Baltic states, if we still take that group, whether it fits or not, but small export-oriented countries that have benefited greatly from the institutions that were built after the Second World War when it comes to trade. And what I referred to earlier with the US-Europe changing relationship, there we have used to be walking arm in arm across the world, really. But what we see now with President Trump and the expression of fair trade rather than free trade, I think there is an opportunity for us to come together and sit down and how can we have a conversation about this? What does it mean, free trade, fair trade, from our perspective? And we need to be vocal in these institutions and to have a view on this. Otherwise, things will change without us. So it's both on trade deficit, on investment issues, and those kind of issues. Those are important for us. So I would like to see more cooperation there within a larger institutional framework. And then when it comes to undermining our institutions and define ourselves and lock others out, I think that's the core thing. It's a difficult thing. As Uffe suggested, I mean, we don't have congruent values, perhaps, in that sense. We don't look completely the same at things. That's one thing. And then we are challenged also within our societies to this regard to a large extent. But it's sometimes easier to project it to the outside world and to other EU members even, or even further away to say, you know, you have a problem with democracy and you have a problem with human rights and so on. But at the same time, there are tendencies in all our countries that put another pressure on politicians, on civil society, on media, to actually act. And that's a very interesting agenda, I think, to work on, because there we all have to be humble, and we all have to look at this in a new way. And then moving into defense cooperation. First, before saying a few things on the EU, I would like to say on NATO, I think the way the partnership has developed with Sweden and Finland these past years since the annexation of Crimea with the Enhanced Opportunities Program, and how NATO has actually been very flexible, and Sweden and Finland have been flexible too, in order to find a pragmatic way to say, okay, we all have to look at this region and cooperate on security. There's a win-win if we put ideology and treaties and so a little bit to the side and see, you know, what do we need to practice on? What do we need to move forward on? Because we all have a responsibility for the security of this region. And looking then at Brexit and the UK, and the development of the EU defense cooperation, I think that's an important way to look ahead when we develop this now during the Brexit negotiations and at the same time as the EU defense cooperation is developing. You know, how can we have the UK involved? This UK says all the time, you know, want to stay committed to European security, and the UK is 20% of the military capacity in the EU at this point. So it's a huge loss for the EU to fill that gap. So I think we have to look at that constructively, and there are also things the Nordic-Baltic states can be useful in. You know, if we discuss this, we can have compositions within the EU. We can have a dialogue on this. So and there are lessons learned. That was one of my points with how NATO has treated partners. I think there are decision-shaping mechanisms that could be applied. The way you work with exercises, training, interoperability, and so on. So there is room for that. I think another important topic for the Nordic Baltics when it comes to EU defense cooperation, how it develops, is the issue of strategic autonomy and how that is developed within the EU. You know, to keep it a bit in order, I would say, avoid duplications, have cost efficiency. When we talk about strategic autonomy, it's a concept that is way ahead to develop. It should be out-of-area operations. You know, it could be without the US. It would enable to be the EU acting without the US, but it's not necessarily so. So there are lots of things to keep your mind on in forging this ahead.
Thank you. Jim, the last remark from the panel in this round, and then we'll open for questions from the audience. So please indicate if you want to put a question. But first, Jim.
I think Ufe's story about the Swedish lion shows you why, when you're in Washington, you're eating popcorn watching this. I mean, how can you? This is excellent. So I'm still eating popcorn, watching what happens in the Nordic world. You know, I thought of a couple of things. As you all were talking about globalization and what the Nordic countries, Nordic-Baltic countries could offer those other nations going through the tragedy in some ways of globalization, but certainly the pain of globalization. I guess back in the late 90s, I was called into a boss's office as the Balkans were on fire. And they said, Jim, we're trying to put together an approach to the Balkans after the fighting stops. And we were thinking that maybe the way the Nordics have worked together could be an example for the Balkans. So could you please write a paper that shows, what we could transplant from the north down into the southeast after the fighting stops? And I just went, oh my God, because Nordic cooperation doesn't work that way. Nordic cooperation is as successful as it is because of the unique nature of the nations and the peoples and the history and the geography of this part of the world. It lends itself to cooperation. It makes it's a facilitator of cooperation if the politics are right and everything, and as we've talked about. Transplanting that into something like the Balkans, after the fighting and the bloodletting and the politics down there and the history down there, was an impossible task. So it shows in a way how hard it is to use the Nordic and the Nordic-Baltic nations and their cooperation as applying to other places or other issues like globalization. Because I was thinking, if I could take things from the Nordic-Baltic area in terms of globalization and how you all handle it and transplant it into the United States, what would we take? And it just is apples and oranges because of our geography and our history and NAFTA and all this. It's just not there. And I think the very good points were made about what I call the social safety net that the Nordic nations have in terms of taking care of people who lose their jobs and retraining and all the kinds of things that that a nation and a government would want to do. And I think we try to do that in the U.S., and the cities try, and the states do. I mean, we have a different system. But, it's just, we are just too big, and the market system as it operates in the United States, which can be pretty tough, doesn't lend itself very well. So globalization, to us, has had just a huge impact that is hard for national policies to deal with, and and you see that. So it's as much as I agree with everything that's said about how well the Nordic nations on the whole are handling things like globalization, it's hard to apply that in other areas. I will say, though, that there are some other things, though. I mean, there's certainly best practices that you all have that aren't very well known. How you go about handling issues, including issues that come out of globalization, that might be applicable to other countries, and cherry-picked, and a little bit here and a little bit there might be applicable. And that is one thing, for there to be a better understanding of how you all go about dealing within your government with the outcome of globalization. I think, too, that you were talking about NORDEFCO and how the Nordic nations, Nordic-Baltic nations, are able to cooperate with one another, not at the expense of NATO or the EU, but in a complementary way. And I say that because a lot of people look on regional cooperation or even NATO-EU cooperation as zero-sum. What's done within NORDEFCO is going to be done at the expense of those nations' involvement in NATO or in the European Union. But I think I find instead that the way you go about it is in much more of a complementary fashion. And that is something that we could all learn from, because there's a lot of subgroups within Europe, and I think how you make your regional cooperation be complementary to a larger institution is critical, and it doesn't come at the expense of that organization. And finally, I think I would say that, you know, it's interesting. We talked about Brexit quite a bit. And I will tell you, I was at the Wilton Park conference before this one, and it was all about Brexit there as well. Even though we were supposed to talk about, Anna was there, we were supposed to talk about European militaries, it always came down to Brexit. And coming from Washington, where it's all about Trump, coming here and hearing nothing but Brexit was fascinating. And today, too, this discussion has turned to Brexit in some ways in the UK. But I think in this case that makes some sense, because as I've thought about something that's very interesting to an American, is something we talked about over breakfast today, and it's the new geometry behind a new balance of power in Europe. If the UK is pulling out of the EU, through Brexit. And we're watching that happen now. We're watching a new, a lot of maneuvering, tectonic plates shifting, the variable geometry that comes with fashioning what is probably a new balance of power, if you will. I use that term not as the 19th century way, but that would have Britain invading Europe. But this is not that. This is another way to try to balance things out. I think part of that will be UK work with the Nordic-Baltic nations, and they've been doing that for a number of years. The Northern Group is an example, the JEF is an example. I've always accused them of cherry-picking allies for their own, you know, I always used to warn them we were going to join the Northern Group if they weren't careful, the United States, and they didn't like that. But so I think, in fact, as we talk about what the Nordic-Baltic nations could do, I think what is going to be inevitable is you will play a role in this new geometry in terms of keeping and making sure the UK is engaged in an EU that doesn't have the UK as a member. The UK is still going to be there. The UK is still going to be engaged with Europe. Maybe not through the EU, but it's going to be there, and there's got to be a balancing of that so we don't have a Europe that's tilted wrong. And I think the United States has a role to play in that too, but that's for another conference. But I do see that probably the biggest impact in terms of Brexit will be a closeness in the Nordic-Baltic relationship with the UK, a lot more initiatives in that grouping that will help the UK achieve an equilibrium in some way with Europe.
Thank you. Very important remarks also here in the end. I have 3 questions over here. I'll take them one by one. First in the front row, then just behind, and then a little bit further down the back, and you will follow in the next round.
Thank you, Sensakko, Director of ICDS. It was amusing at the beginning of a friendly argument about who did most in 1991 till 2004, I put it this way. I would say now that sadly, after 2004, Denmark lost interest in the Baltic security and defense, and was totally committed only on out-of-area operations and things far away and the capabilities for needed for that. And Sweden did not lose interest, but was demilitarizing. Now 2014 changed a lot of things. We also saw Danes actually literally flying back in as a first nation in 1st of May in 2014 to pick up the additional air policing from Amari airfield in Tallinn. So the first question is really the classical Hillary Clinton question, what happened and how to avoid it in the future. But second, broader question is really, it has been mostly about defense. What ideas do you have on the stage for a wider Nordic-Baltic cooperation in any other field beyond defense? Thank you.
Thank you. Next, a little further behind.
Where?
No, up there first.
Thank you. Stephen Dale from London. Very quick one. Perhaps appropriately, I've had a rather Hans Christian Andersen moment, the King's New Clothes. I feel as if I go back to 1991. Here we are talking about a new agenda for Nordic-Baltic countries. Why is there no one from Estonia, Latvia or Lithuania on the panel?
Or Finland, Norway, Iceland.
Thank you. And then behind there, in the middle.
Thank you. Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform. I think it's following up the end of Sven's question, which is one area outside the defence sphere is energy security. I mean, it's striking that the Baltic states are still on the Russian electricity grid, not on the European electricity grid. There are one or two interconnectors, but not many. So is there an agenda there for the Nordic-Baltic cooperation to improve the energy security of this area?
Thank you. I'll not give you all an opportunity to answer all questions, but who wants to lead? Uffe?
A confession, you're right. Denmark transferred its interest around 2004 to the other side of the world. And why, you ask? Well, I referred in my initial remarks to this report that was made by a defense commission, where they said that within the foreseeable future, there will be no threats in our own region. That's why. It was proved wrong, and the Danes came back, and I was presented with a beautiful bracelet from one of my Estonian friends. We are allies with a Union Jack, a tricolor, an Estonian flag, and a Danish flag that we actually got up there some centuries ago. That's a different story. So we are back. What can be done to avoid that in the future? Try to be more realistic. Energy, just a brief remark on energy, because you are so right. Actually, there is a lot of work being done on the electricity grids. First of all, cables to Sweden, etc. But one thing that still surprises me is that when this Nord Stream 1 was created, and now they are talking about a Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 1 should never have been allowed, but it came. I know there was a project at that time called the Amber Line, which was a gas pipeline going from Greifswald in Germany through Poland to Lithuania, connecting this stream of Russian natural gas with the networks already existing in the Baltic countries, so that they could not be shunted off. I don't know why it has not been built. And considering the fact that so many have had their fingers down in Gazprom's pockets, picking out a lot of money concerning Nord Stream 1, my question to my friends in the region is, who was bought off to stop that project that should have stopped the old system to continue?
Thank you. Jim?
To Sven, I have to say it was more than Denmark. I think as I look back on those days, two things happened to make not just Denmark, but a lot of the allies break off of these programs that we built during the 90s. Not just for the Baltics, but for a lot of the new nations coming out of the Warsaw Pact. You know, the 90s was a very busy time as we were all working with them. And then once these nations got into NATO, we just kind of went like this, job done. And particularly I'm talking about the United States here, our assistance programs went other places. And so myself and others, we had to fight like hell just to get what we could in terms of assistance monies and attention, that type of thing. That was the first thing, was NATO membership. And the second thing was after 9/11, it was Iraq, it was Afghanistan, and we were totally consumed with that. So, you know, it was not a good time for those who did Europe in the interagency in Washington. We were not the top of the agenda, and so we did the best we could to keep things going as the U.S. withdrew forces out of Europe, and we had sequestration, which made us get smaller, and all of that rippled into how much attention we could give to the Baltic nations, for instance, relative to what we did in the 90s. But like Uffe said, you know, one thing Putin did when he went into Crimea, we were back, baby, and you know, and I was getting phone calls and invitations to parties, and all of a sudden Europe was popular again for the wrong reasons. But there you go, and so we are back. And I don't have a bracelet, but I do know that as long as I'm alive, we're not going to reverse course again, because that was a big mistake, and we're back. So,
thank you. I'll take 3 more very rapid questions, and then a few answers, and then we are done in 3 or 4 minutes from now. So I have you in the back, you there, and you there. Microphone there in the middle.
Thank you. My name is Karsten Friis. I'm from Norway, so I can be the Norwegian voice. I'm working at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. It's more of a comment. I want to follow up what you're saying. I mean, let's be honest, Nordic defense cooperation has not been very prosperous. We had Nordefco, but it hasn't really delivered much. We did this to save money and to get more pooling and sharing, as it were. And lots of lies, political words, but not much came out of it, procurement and other things. Since Crimea, of course, all that changed, because now we have a general shared security concern. And even Norwegians who always look into Atlantic have started to look behind our backs a little bit and say, oops, something is happening here, and we have to share it. So my comment is that there's a huge potential now to rethink how this can, to rethink how we can do things together. And I think the first very concrete step we can do is to share information, intelligence, and situational awareness in our neighborhood. We don't do that now. And given that, you know, just the range of the missiles gives us a reason to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. A very specific and concrete proposal, please.
Thank you, Hamid Lajavardi. Nordic-Baltic. The Nordic countries are some of the richest countries in Europe. The Baltics are on the lower rung of Europe. Are there any plans, any strategies to create convergence or reduce the inequality?
Thank you. And then, last question.
Thank you. I'm Ann-Sofie Dahl. I'm a Swede living in Copenhagen with an American affiliation. I have a quick comment and a quick question. My comment is that, Urban, you mentioned windows of opportunity. And there was a window of opportunity, and there was another one that was unfortunately missed in the 90s, and that was Sweden and Finland going into NATO. That was another one. My question is, the broader Nordic-Baltic region also includes the Arctic, or part of the Arctic. How do you, on the panel, interpret what is happening up there? Is it just peaceful, acceptable modernization, or is it something we should be concerned about, what the Russians are doing? And how should we respond? We being the West, the EU, the Nordics, NATO, anyone who feels ready to comment. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a bit dangerous to move to the Arctic because it's a slightly different subject, but an important one and a favorite one of mine too. You get, with Urban starting, very brief answers, but I'm really talking now of very brief answers because we have to wind up in a few minutes.
Yeah, sure. First to Sven, I think it was obvious that the interest should be lowered because the Baltic countries joined the NATO and joined the European Union. And in the meantime, before the independence, until that, all the countries in the Nordic realized that we need to, fill that gap. When it comes to the energy security, I mean, I think it was in February 2016, Sweden opened up the Nordic-Baltic between Nybro and Klaipeda, where we actually, connect so we can have electricity back and forth. It has an enormous security policy effect. Nordefco, I do not agree. I think actually Nordefco has delivered much more than expected. I think it has been a success. We could do more, of course, but saying that it hasn't delivered much, I think that is actually wrong. When it comes to the Arctic, I would like to follow the Norwegian example. I think they are doing a wonderful job there, in stressing the environmental issues and showing how you can actually explore the resources, but doing it in an environmentally friendly way.
Thank you. Anna?
Yes, first, just on the role of Denmark, I think it's right, they disappeared, but I think it's important to acknowledge that Denmark was very important for driving closer cooperation between Sweden, Finland and NATO after 2014 in NATO. They were instrumental in that work. I've done research on that, so I think Denmark should have credit for that as well. On topics, I think we have touched upon quite a few: free trade, cyber, digitalization, that we can work to. The Nordics should be more coordinated as a group and more advocate and articulate within the EU, for instance, on those issues. And that's the work. How do we define that? Because we have a lot of coordination groups, but I think we have to work in a new way and put new energy into these issues and make an analysis of how the world is shifting and the positions ahead. So I think you can find a range of topics. It's not only the EU, it's NATO, it's also the UN with the human rights and how that is challenged in different groups along, and the economical international institutions, as I mentioned. I think on the Arctic, just shortly, yes, it's changing up there, of course, with the Russian military buildup, as we see. Cooperation is continuing among the Arctic countries. I think it's important to understand the Russian offense-defense dilemma that they have in the Arctic to some extent when you consider this. But we also need to look at this with new eyes and perhaps new formations in the countries engaged in the Arctic, I would say.
Thank you. Jim?
Just quickly, just say on NORDEFCO, I think the point on intel sharing is important, and I think that is something that there can be more done. But NORDEFCO is not what it's done today. I mean, the great success up to this point has been the fact that it exists. And things are coming together among the Nordic countries. How far it can go is a good question. That depends on the willingness of some of the members of NORDEFCO to push some boundaries. But I wanted to say NORDEFCO is a good thing, and it strengthens NATO too. So there's a great thing there. On Arctic, Anne-Sophie Dahl, good to see you. On Arctic, I would say that an important point there is that that's where we work with Russia. And that's the one part of the relationship with Russia where we actually sit down and get things done. And so that's an important thing to think about on the one hand. On the other hand, that's also where we're concerned because of security issues. But the Russia angle is something to remember. Last point on the Nordic work within the EU and some of the things what Anna said. I just wanted to make again the point that I think for the Nordic nations to really be able to do something of substance within the EU, it's also a matter of expanding out your group to include some of these other countries that you might be able to pick off and make into something muscular. So,
thank you. Ulf, you get the last brief remark.
Very brief on the Arctic. We have the so-called Ilulissat Agreement between Russia, United States, Canada, Norway, and Denmark for Greenland. The 5 countries bordering up to the Arctic. And this agreement says that we shall follow international rules in taking care of whatever different interests we have there. We shall insist on following this agreement, and in order to be able to insist, we shall all be present there. Final remark, do we need a convergence between the rich Nordic countries and the not-so-affluent Baltic countries? Come on now, what do you call developments over the last 10 years? If that is not convergence, who came fastest out of the financial global crisis? Because they knew the old saying, if you're in a hole, stop digging. The Baltics did. And if you try to extrapolate a little, it will not take a long time before you are richer than we are.
On this happy note, thank you a lot to the panel. Thank you so much for your contributions. And thank you. There'll now be break, of course. And I invite you to be back here after coffee at 1600 hours for the next session. Thank you.